Picture this. It's 1876 on the Texas plains, and you're crouched behind an overturned wagon, listening to the sound that every frontier family learned to fear. Apache war cries cutting through the howling wind like broken glass through cotton. William "Wild Bill" Thornton, and, yes, that's actually what they called him, though he earned that nickname more for his wild theories about wind than his gunfighting, is pressed against the splintered wood next to his younger brother James. Their mother is pinned down near the ranch house, about 100 yards away, with 3 Apache warriors closing in. The wind is doing what Texas wind does best, making everything impossible. Now, when we talk about wind on the frontier, we're not talking about a gentle breeze that messes up your hair. We're talking about nature's own artillery barrage. Think about standing next to a freight train, but instead of lasting 30 seconds, it lasts all day, every day, for months at a time. The Texas Panhandle wind could knock a grown man sideways, turn a simple walk to the outhouse into an expedition, and, most importantly for our story, push a bullet 3 feet off target at 100 yards. James Thornton was 22 years old, 2 years younger than William, and he was what you'd call a natural shot, the kind of marksman who could put 5 bullets through a silver dollar at 50 paces on a calm day. But this wasn't a calm day. This was the kind of day where the wind screamed across the prairie like a living thing, bending the grass flat and filling the air with enough dust to choke a horse. "I can make the shot," James whispered to his brother, his voice barely audible over the wind's roar. "Ma's counting on us." William grabbed his brother's arm. He'd been studying wind patterns for 3 years now, an obsession that started when he missed an easy deer shot and watched his family go hungry for a week because of it. He could read the air currents in the way, the grass bent, in the spiral of dust devils dancing across the plain, in the very feel of the wind against his face, and what he read now made his blood run cold. "Wait for the lull," William said. "The wind's gusting 15 to 20 miles per hour from the southwest. It'll push your shot wide by." But James was already moving. He'd spotted one of the Apache warriors breaking cover, making his final approach toward their mother's hiding spot. There wasn't time for calculations or wind readings. There was only time for action. James rose from behind the wagon, his rifle already at his shoulder. He was fast, faster than his older brother, and his instincts were sharp. But instincts, no matter how good, couldn't account for the sudden gust that chose that exact moment to sweep across the prairie like the hand of an angry god. The shot cracked through the air, and both brothers watched in horror as the bullet sailed wide, not by inches, but by feet. 3 feet to the right of the Apache warrior, who turned at the sound and immediately identified the source of the threat. The return shot didn't miss. Now, I want you to understand something about the reality of frontier medicine. When someone took a bullet in 1876 Texas, you had 3 options. Dig it out yourself, ride 50 miles to the nearest doctor, assuming he was sober, and assuming you lived that long, or prepare to meet your maker. James Thornton took that Apache bullet in the chest, and as William cradled his dying brother in his arms, watching the light fade from eyes that looked so much like his own, something broke inside him, and something else was born. "I'm going to beat it," William whispered, his voice carrying a promise that would have sounded like madness to anyone who heard it. "I'm going to beat the wind." James died as the dust storm rolled in, turning day to twilight and filling the air with grit that tasted like failure and regret. The Apache warriors had already melted away into the storm. They understood wind better than any white man alive, knew when to fight and when to disappear like smoke. William's mother survived, but the cost of that survival would haunt the Thornton family for the rest of their days. You have to understand, life on the frontier wasn't just shaped by wind, it was dominated by it. Settlers didn't build houses on hills, they dug them into hillsides to escape the relentless gusts. Children learned to read dust devils, like city kids learned to read street signs, because knowing which way the wind was blowing could mean the difference between making it home for supper or spending the night lost on the prairie. And then there was the economics of accuracy. Every bullet that missed its target wasn't just a failure, it was money literally blown away by the wind. A box of ammunition cost a day's wages for most ranch hands. Miss a deer because of wind, and you'd just lost a week's worth of food for your family. Miss a shot during an Indian raid, and you might lose everything you'd ever loved. The Thornton family had settled in New Braunfels, one of those German Texan communities where old-world precision met new-world pragmatism head-on. William's grandfather Klaus had been a clockmaker in Bavaria, a man who understood that nature, no matter how wild it seemed, followed patterns. Even the wind. Der Wind, Klaus would say in his thick accent, watching young William practice with his first rifle, ist nicht ein Feind, es ist nur misunderstood. Klaus taught William that everything in nature had a rhythm, a pattern, a logic that could be learned if you paid attention. The old clockmaker had applied that philosophy to gears and springs and pendulums. William would apply it to something far more dangerous and unpredictable. But here's what made the frontier so brutal. Eastern manufacturers built their rifles for calm shooting ranges, for gentlemen's clubs, where the biggest challenge was a stiff breeze off the Hudson River. They had no idea what it meant to shoot in conditions where the wind never stopped, where a sudden gust could turn a perfect shot into a family tragedy. The Apache and Comanche warriors who raided the Texas settlements, they held the strategic advantage precisely because they understood wind in ways that no white settler ever could. They'd learned wind wisdom from their grandfathers, who'd learned it from their grandfathers, going back generations. They could read the air like we read a newspaper, seeing storm fronts hours before they arrived, feeling pressure changes in their bones, using wind direction to mask their approach or confuse their enemies. Mexican vaqueros, too, had their own wind law. They'd teach anyone willing to listen how to read wind in the movement of grass, in the flight patterns of birds, in the very feel of air against sweaty skin. But here's the thing about that knowledge. It was intuitive, almost mystical. You couldn't write it down in a manual or teach it in a classroom. It died with each master who possessed it. William Thornton was about to change all that. After James's funeral, William began what his neighbors would later call his madness, firing thousands of rounds in every kind of weather condition imaginable. While other ranchers were working their cattle or tending their crops, William was out on the range with his rifle and his leather journals, methodically documenting how wind affected bullet trajectories. His young wife Sarah would stand on the porch of their modest ranch house, watching her husband shoot at targets in dust storms so thick she could barely see him 50 yards away. The sound of gunfire became the soundtrack of their marriage, crack, 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 echoing across the prairie dawn to dusk. "He's spending our cattle money on ammunition," Sarah confided to her sister in a letter that still survives today. "The neighbors are calling him the mad cowboy. I'm starting to think they might be right." But William had seen something that day his brother died. As he'd watched that Apache warrior's bullet find its mark despite the howling wind, he'd realized that some men, some very few men, had learned to work with the wind instead of fighting against it. And if they could do it through instinct and tradition, maybe he could do it through science and determination. The breakthrough came on a September morning, when William was watching a red-tailed hawk hunt during a windstorm. The bird dove toward a prairie mouse, its wings tilting and adjusting in micro-movements that compensated for every gust, every shift in air pressure. The hawk didn't fight the wind, it used it, rode it, became part of it. And as William watched that perfect predator make its kill, he realized that bullets, like hawks, had to spin through the air. They had physics, predictable physics, even in unpredictable wind. That night, by lamplight in his kitchen while Sarah slept, William Thornton began sketching the design for something that had never existed before. A rifle sight that could calculate wind compensation. He was about to turn an intuitive art practiced by a few into a science that could be learned by many. He had no idea that his obsession would eventually catch the attention of gunmakers back east, trigger a corporate war that would span 2 decades, and ultimately change the course of military history. All he knew was that somewhere out there, the wind was still blowing, and it was still killing people who deserved better. But William "Mad Cowboy" Thornton was about to make the wind his servant instead of his master. The question was, would he survive long enough to see it happen? By 1879, William Thornton had filled 17 leather journals with what looked like the ravings of a madman. Page after page of hand-drawn charts showing bullet drift patterns, wind speed calculations written in pencil so faded you could barely read them, and sketches of mechanical devices that seemed to defy common sense. His neighbours had long since stopped calling him Wild Bill and settled on Mad Cowboy, a title that followed him like a shadow as he prepared for the most important journey of his life. The trip east was a desperate gamble. Sarah had sold her grandmother's silver to buy him train fare to Hartford, Connecticut, home of Colt's Manufacturing Company. As the locomotive pulled away from San Antonio, black smoke billowing against the endless Texas sky, William clutched those journals like they contained the secrets of the universe. In a way, they did. Hartford in 1879 was everything that Texas wasn't: humid instead of dry, green instead of brown, and absolutely, completely still. No wind. William stepped off the train into air so motionless it felt dead, and for a moment he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. How do you explain wind to people who've never really felt it? The reception at Colt's Manufacturing was about what you'd expect when a sunburned cowboy in dusty clothes walks into the mahogany-panelled offices of America's premier firearms company. The secretary looked at William like he'd tracked something unpleasant in on his boots, which, to be fair, he probably had. "I need to speak with Mr. Colt about improving rifle accuracy in wind conditions," William announced, his Texas drawl cutting through the refined Connecticut atmosphere like a dull knife through silk. Samuel Colt was dead by then, but his son Caldwell ran the company with the same mixture of innovation and arrogance that had made the Colt name famous. When Caldwell finally agreed to see this prairie dreamer, mostly out of curiosity, the meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. "Mr. Thornton," Caldwell said, barely glancing at the journals William had spread across his desk, "we sell firearms to civilized markets. Our customers shoot at targets that don't move, in weather that doesn't change. What you're describing sounds like a solution to a problem that doesn't exist." William tried to explain. He pulled out his most detailed charts, showing how a crosswind of 15 miles per hour could push a bullet 3 feet off target at 200 yards. He described the economics of accuracy on the frontier, where every missed shot cost money families couldn't afford to lose. He even told them about James, about watching his brother die because the wind made an easy shot impossible. The room full of Eastern gunsmiths laughed. Actually laughed. "Son," said the chief engineer, a man who'd never been west of the Hudson River, "if cowboys can't hit what they're aiming at, maybe they should practice more." But there was one man in that room who wasn't laughing. Hans Zimmermann stood in the back corner, a master clockmaker from Munich who'd immigrated to America 5 years earlier and found work crafting the precision mechanisms that made Colt's rifles function. Zimmermann had spent his life understanding how tiny mechanical adjustments could create perfect accuracy, and something in William's obsessive documentation reminded him of his own journey from apprentice to master. After the meeting, as William gathered his rejected journals and prepared for the long journey back to failure, Zimmermann approached him in the hallway. "Your calculations," the German said in accented English, "they are not crazy, they are incomplete." That conversation changed everything. Zimmermann had been studying William's charts during the meeting, and his trained eye had spotted something the American gunsmiths missed. The patterns were real. The mathematics were sound. What William had discovered through pure observation and determination was scientifically valid. It just needed the precision engineering that only someone like Zimmermann could provide. "I cannot leave Colt," Zimmermann explained as they walked through Hartford's gaslit streets. "But I have saved money, perhaps. Texas has need for a clockmaker, yes?" 3 months later, Hans Zimmermann stepped off the train in San Antonio, carrying 2 leather cases filled with precision tools and a head full of ideas about how to turn William's wind charts into mechanical reality. Sarah Thornton took one look at the serious German with his measuring instruments and careful way of speaking, and knew their lives were about to change forever. Whether for better or worse remained to be seen. They set up shop in a converted barn on the outskirts of town, a ramshackle building that had once stored grain and now housed what might have been the strangest partnership in American manufacturing history. Zimmerman contributed mathematical precision and metalworking expertise that would have impressed craftsmen in Vienna. William provided field knowledge gained through 3 years of obsessive testing and a shooting range that stretched as far as the eye could see. Sarah kept the books, recording every expense with the meticulous care of someone who knew they were betting everything on an idea that most people considered insane. Ammunition costs, metal stock, tool maintenance, every penny, documented as they burned through their savings pursuing perfection. The work was brutal. Zimmerman's engineering background told him that compensating for wind meant creating adjustable sights with multiple moving parts, sliding scales, spirit levels, and graduated markings that could account for wind speed and direction. William's field experience told him that anything too complicated would fail in frontier conditions, where dust and weather destroyed delicate mechanisms. They built prototype after prototype, each one a compromise between precision and practicality. Test number 12 exploded during firing, sending shrapnel through the barn wall and convincing Sarah that she'd married a man determined to kill himself for science. Test number 17 was even worse. The barrel burst during a high-pressure round, throwing both men clear through the barn wall and leaving Zimmerman permanently deaf in his left ear. Local ranchers started taking bets on which test would finally put an end to the crazy cowboy and his German partner. The odds favored death by explosion, though a few smart money types bet on death by bankruptcy instead. But they kept working. Zimmerman's clockmaker precision, married to William's frontier pragmatism, slowly produced innovations that neither man could have achieved alone. They discovered that rifling spin creates predictable drift patterns that can be calculated and compensated for. They realized that wind speed indicators positioned at multiple distances could provide the data needed for accurate adjustments. Most importantly, they figured out how to build graduated sight adjustments that matched wind speed to bullet compensation. Test number 31 changed everything. It was a crude system by later standards, a rifle sight with 2T16 changers, adjustable windage knobs, spirit levels to indicate weapon cant, and sliding scales marked with wind compensation charts. But when William squeezed the trigger on that October morning, with a crosswind gusting at 18 miles per hour, the bullet went exactly where he aimed it. They tested it again, and again, and again. Word spread through Texas like wildfire in August grass. The mad cowboy and his German partner had actually done it, too. They'd built a rifle that could hit targets in conditions that made normal shooting impossible. Orders started trickling in from ranchers who'd heard rumors, then from Texas Rangers who'd seen demonstrations, then from anyone who made their living with a rifle and understood what wind compensation meant. The shooting exhibition at the San Antonio Stock Show turned that trickle into a flood. Picture this. 3,000 people gathered to watch what most expected to be an entertaining failure. William had set up targets at 50, 100, and 200 yards, with ribbon indicators showing wind speed and direction at each distance. His competition was Miguel Vasquez, a Mexican vaquero famous throughout South Texas for his ability to read wind and adjust for it through pure instinct. On a calm day, both men could have shot perfect scores. But this wasn't a calm day. This was Texas, and the wind was doing what Texas wind does best. Vasquez, using traditional methods and a lifetime of experience, managed to hit 3 out of 10 targets. Impressive, considering the conditions. William, using his wind gauge system and Zimmerman's precision sights, hit all 10. The crowd went silent. Then someone started cheering, and the cheering spread until 3,000 people were on their feet, applauding a revolution they'd just witnessed but didn't quite understand yet. That's when things got complicated. Because somewhere back east, in the mahogany-paneled offices of America's firearms manufacturers, people were starting to pay attention to the mad cowboy from Texas. And they didn't like what they were hearing. Not one bit. As William and Zimmerman loaded their demonstration equipment into their wagon that evening, neither man noticed the well-dressed strangers who'd been taking notes during the exhibition. Neither man realized that their success had just painted a target on their backs a target that would soon attract the attention of corporate interests with far more resources and far fewer scruples than two inventors working out of a converted barn. The wind had made William Thornton its enemy. Now he was about to discover that the wind was the least dangerous force he'd have to face. The patent filing that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in March of 1881. William Thornton and Hans Zimmermann stood in the marble halls of the Patent Office in Washington, District of Columbia, surrounded by the kind of formal grandeur that made Texas ranch hands feel like they were trespassing in a cathedral. The clerk who accepted their application, patent number 247,512, had no idea he was documenting the start of a corporate war that would span 2 decades and reshape American manufacturing. Within a week, the telegrams started arriving in San Antonio. The first offer came from Remington Arms Company, $5,000 for all patent rights and manufacturing agreements. When William politely declined, explaining that he and Zimmermann intended to produce the rifles themselves, the tone of the correspondence changed dramatically. The second telegram was less polite. The third wasn't polite at all. Winchester Repeating Arms Company took a different approach. They sent representatives, 3 well-dressed men in expensive suits who arrived on the noon train and made their way to Thornton's ranch with the purposeful stride of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. Their leader, a smooth-talking Easterner named Crawford, spread documents across Sarah's kitchen table and made what he called a generous offer. $10,000, Mr. Thornton. More money than most men see in a lifetime. All you have to do is sign these papers and go back to ranching. Leave the gun manufacturing to people who understand the business. William studied the contracts while Sarah served coffee that none of the visitors touched. The terms were simple. Sell the patents, agree never to manufacture competing products, and accept a modest consulting fee that would end the moment William caused any complications for Winchester's market position. "Gentlemen," William said finally, "I appreciate your offer, but my brother died because existing rifles can't handle frontier conditions. I didn't spend 3 years perfecting this system just to hand it over to the same people who've been ignoring the problem." Crawford's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Mr. Thornton, you seem to misunderstand the situation. This isn't really a negotiation. This is us being polite before we stop being polite." The threats started small. Orders for Thornton's wind-compensated rifles mysteriously began getting delayed or cancelled. Suppliers who'd been eager to work with the famous Mad Cowboy suddenly found reasons to take their business elsewhere. Then, on a moonless night in October, masked raiders struck Zimmermann's workshop while he was visiting family in New Braunfels. They smashed prototypes with sledgehammers, scattered precision tools across the dirt floor, and made off with 2 years' worth of detailed engineering drawings. But Sarah Thornton had been expecting trouble. The most crucial designs, the ones that really mattered, were hidden in her butter churn, wrapped in oilcloth and buried beneath pounds of fresh cream that no self-respecting corporate spy would think to search. Hans Zimmermann's workshop burned down the following week. The local sheriff called it an electrical fire, though Zimmermann's shop didn't have electricity. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, nothing remained but twisted metal and the acrid smell of dreams going up in smoke. But Zimmermann had managed to save his most important tools, the precision instruments that couldn't be replaced and couldn't be duplicated by anyone else in Texas. "They think they can scare us into giving up," William told Sarah as they surveyed the wreckage. "They don't understand that we've already lost everything that really mattered. What's a workshop compared to James?" The military trials at Fort Sam Houston in 1882 changed the entire dynamic of the conflict. Colonel James Whitaker was a Civil War veteran who'd earned his reputation as a sharpshooter at Gettysburg, where precise marksmanship under pressure meant the difference between victory and defeat. When news of Thornton's wind compensation system reached his desk, Whitaker's response was immediate: "Prove it." The demonstration took place on a windy March morning that reminded every Texan present why they'd learned to hate the weather. Whitaker had assembled 20 of his best marksmen, men who could group their shots within a handspan at 100 yards under ideal conditions. The test was simple. Hit 10 targets at distances ranging from 100 to 400 yards, with crosswinds gusting up to 25 miles per hour. Using standard military rifles, the 20 marksmen managed to hit a combined total of 37 targets out of 200 attempts. Decent shooting for such conditions, but hardly the kind of accuracy that wins battles. William Thornton, using his wind-compensated rifle system, hit 96 out of 100 targets. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Texas wind whistling through the gaps in the fort's wooden walls. Colonel Whitaker walked to the furthest target, 400 yards away, and examined the bullet holes clustered around the bull's eye like flowers around a stem. "Mr. Thornton," he said when he returned, "how many rifles can you manufacture, and how quickly can you manufacture them?" But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Word of the Fort Sam Houston trials had spread through military circles faster than gossip in a small town, and it reached the ears of someone who understood accuracy better than almost anyone alive, Annie Oakley. The legendary competition at the National Rifle Championships in 1884 became the stuff of shooting folklore. Picture this: 10,000 spectators gathered in Chicago to watch America's most famous sharpshooter face off against the mad cowboy from Texas. The weather was typical for Lake Michigan in October, windy, unpredictable, and absolutely brutal for precision shooting. Annie Oakley was everything you'd expect from her reputation: calm, focused, and so naturally gifted that she made impossible shots look routine. She'd been shooting since she was 8 years old, supporting her family by hunting game that she sold to hotels in Cincinnati. By 1884, she could hit a playing card edgewise at 30 paces, shoot the flame off a candle without melting the wax, and perform trick shots that defied belief. But Annie had learned to shoot in Ohio, where wind was an occasional inconvenience rather than a constant adversary. William had learned to shoot in Texas, where wind was the enemy that never slept. The match format was simple: 10 shots each at targets ranging from 50 to 300 yards, with scoring based on proximity to the bull's eye. The wind was gusting between 15 and 30 miles per hour, shifting direction every few minutes like a living thing, determined to make both shooters look foolish. Annie shot first, and her performance was everything the crowd expected. She compensated for wind through pure instinct and decades of experience, adjusting her aim with the kind of split-second timing that separates legends from mere mortals. Her shots were grouped within a 6-inch circle at the longest distance, shooting that would have been considered phenomenal under any conditions. Then William stepped to the firing line with his wind-compensated rifle, its unusual sights and adjustment knobs looking almost alien compared to Annie's standard Remington. He took readings from his wind indicators positioned at multiple distances, made calculations that seemed to take forever, and adjusted his sights with the methodical precision of a clockmaker tuning a timepiece. His shots were grouped within a 3-inch circle at 300 yards. The crowd erupted, but Annie Oakley's response became part of shooting legend. As the judges announced William's victory, she walked over to examine his rifle, studying the wind compensation system with the professional curiosity of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "I can outshoot any man," she said, loud enough for the newspaper reporters to hear. But William Thornton doesn't shoot, he calculates. It was the kind of endorsement that money couldn't buy and enemies couldn't suppress. International attention followed immediately. German military attachés who'd been skeptical of American small arms technology suddenly found themselves sending urgent telegrams to Berlin. British observers who'd dismissed the colony's manufacturing capabilities started placing orders for evaluation rifles. The Spanish-American War of 1898 provided the ultimate proving ground. American soldiers equipped with Thornton-trained rifles and wind compensation techniques dominated in Cuba's coastal conditions, where Caribbean trade winds made standard marksmanship nearly impossible. Military doctrine that had remained unchanged since the Civil War was revolutionized in a matter of months. But success, as William was about to learn, could be more dangerous than failure. The same corporate interests that had tried to buy him out, then scare him off, were now preparing for more direct action. And this time, they weren't sending lawyers or threatening letters. They were sending killers. The Range War of 1898 wasn't called that in the newspapers. They preferred terms like industrial dispute and patent conflict. But anyone who lived through those 3 days in November knew exactly what it was. A military-style assault on the Thornton Ranch by 17 hired guns with orders to eliminate the mad cowboy and anyone foolish enough to stand with him. William had been expecting them. The telegrams from Washington had stopped coming. His military contacts had gone silent. Even Colonel Whitaker's letters, which had arrived like clockwork for 2 years, had suddenly ceased. When you've spent your life reading wind patterns, you learn to recognize other kinds of storms approaching. The siege began at dawn. On November 15th, 17 men with rifles and enough ammunition to outfit a small army took positions in the hills surrounding the Thornton Ranch. Their leader was a former Confederate officer named Marcus Pike, a man who'd learned his trade during the war and refined it in the employ of various corporate interests with problems that needed permanent solutions. For 3 days, William Thornton held them off using the very rifles he'd spent a decade perfecting. His wind-compensated sights allowed him to make shots that his attackers couldn't even attempt, picking them off from ranges and angles that should have been impossible. By the second day, Pike had lost 6 men and was beginning to understand why Eastern manufacturers were so desperate to eliminate this particular problem. But 17 against 1 are impossible odds, no matter how good your equipment. On the third dawn, as William was repositioning to a new firing point, a bullet found its mark, not through superior shooting or tactical brilliance, but through the simple mathematics of sustained gunfire. If enough people shoot at you for long enough, eventually someone gets lucky. Sarah found him slumped against the barn wall where he'd made his last stand, his wind-compensated rifle still clutched in hands that had spent 20 years trying to defeat the undefeatable. His last words, spoken in a whisper she had to lean close to hear, were, "The wind still blows, but it blows true now." Marcus Pike and his surviving men melted away before the authorities arrived, leaving behind only brass casings and the kind of official silence that spoke louder than any confession. The corporate executives who'd ordered the hit returned to their mahogany offices and expensive cigars, confident that they'd eliminated the threat to their market dominance. But they'd made one crucial mistake. William Thornton hadn't worked alone, and he hadn't kept his secrets to himself. Hidden in that converted barn, teaching precision shooting to anyone willing to learn, was a Chinese immigrant son named Marcus Chen, who'd absorbed every lesson the mad cowboy had to offer. And Marcus Chen was about to carry those lessons into a new century, where the stakes would be higher and the applications more deadly than even William Thornton had ever imagined. Marcus Chen was 19 years old when he watched William Thornton die, and in that moment, he understood that he'd inherited more than just shooting techniques. He'd inherited a responsibility that would shape the rest of his life. The son of Chinese immigrants who'd come to America to build the Transcontinental Railroad, Marcus had grown up between 2 worlds: the precise, methodical culture of his father's homeland and the wild, improvisational spirit of the Texas frontier. William had seen something special in the young man's ability to blend Eastern patience with Western pragmatism, while other students struggled to master Thornton's wind-reading principles. Marcus absorbed them like dry earth absorbs rain. He understood that defeating wind wasn't about fighting it. It was about becoming part of it, reading its patterns, predicting its behavior, and using that knowledge to achieve what others considered impossible. In 1901, 3 years after Thornton's death, Marcus Chen established the Thornton Chen Precision Shooting Academy in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of San Antonio. Sarah Thornton, now a widow carrying the weight of her husband's legacy, provided the initial funding and moral support. Hans Zimmerman, his hearing damaged but his precision intact, contributed the engineering expertise that kept Thornton's innovations moving forward. The Academy's first students were an unlikely collection of individuals, Texas Rangers looking to improve their effectiveness in frontier conditions, military officers seeking any advantage they could find, and competitive shooters who'd heard rumors about the Technolipot mad cowboys' revolutionary techniques. But as word spread, the students began arriving from places William Thornton had never imagined his ideas would reach. European military attachés sent observers to study American wind compensation methods. Japanese military advisors, modernizing their forces after centuries of isolation, dispatched their most promising marksmen to learn Western shooting techniques. Even Annie Oakley herself spent a week at the academy, working with Marcus to understand the mathematical principles behind Thornton's intuitive wind-reading methods. But it was the arrival of the Great War in 1914 that truly tested everything William Thornton had discovered about defeating wind. The trenches of France presented shooting conditions that made the Texas prairie look gentle by comparison. Artillery barrages created their own weather systems, with explosions generating wind shears and pressure differentials that could push bullets wildly off course. Poison. Gas attacks filled the air with dense, swirling clouds that made traditional aiming impossible. And then there was no man's land, that desolate stretch between opposing trenches where a missed shot meant death and an accurate shot meant survival. American marksmen trained at the Thornton Chen Academy arrived in France with skills that their European counterparts found almost supernatural. They could hit targets through conditions that made other snipers pack up and wait for better weather. They understood how to read wind in the smoke and chaos of battle, how to compensate for the pressure waves created by nearby explosions, and how to make shots that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a Chicago police officer who trained with Marcus Chen before shipping out to France, wrote home about his experiences. "The German snipers are good, but they don't understand wind the way we do. They wait for calm moments that never come. We shoot when the wind tells us to shoot, and we hit what we aim at." The systematic documentation that Marcus Chen was creating proved something remarkable. William Thornton's hand-drawn charts, created through pure observation and determination, were 94% accurate when compared to modern ballistic calculations. A Texas cowboy with no formal education had intuited principles that would later require advanced mathematics to prove. But the real revolution was cultural. Before Thornton, wind reading was an art practiced by a gifted few, Apache warriors, Mexican vaqueros, and the occasional frontier marksman with exceptional instincts. After Thornton, wind compensation became democratized knowledge that could be taught, learned, and systematically improved. This democratization had unexpected consequences. Women began entering competitive shooting in record numbers, once wind calculations replaced pure physical strength as the determining factor in accuracy. Sarah Thornton herself became one of the finest shots in Texas, carrying on her husband's work with a precision that would have made him proud. Hunting ethics evolved as longer accurate ranges demanded greater responsibility from sportsmen. Small-town shooting clubs across America began teaching Thornton's laws, the three fundamental principles of wind reading that William had discovered while watching hawks hunt on the prairie. The folklore grew along with the practical applications. Stories about the mad cowboy who'd tamed the untamable wind spread from military barracks to frontier saloons, evolving with each telling but always maintaining the essential truth. One man's obsession with accuracy had changed the fundamental relationship between marksmen and the forces of nature. World War II brought new challenges and new validations of Thornton's principles. The Pacific Theater, with its typhoons and trade winds, might have been designed specifically to test everything the Thornton Chen Academy had taught about wind. Compensation. American snipers in the jungles of Guadalcanal and the atolls of the Marshall Islands found themselves shooting in conditions that would have defeated marksmen using traditional methods. The European theater presented different challenges. Urban warfare in the rubble of destroyed cities created wind patterns unlike anything in nature. Air currents channeled through broken buildings, deflected by collapsed walls, and twisted by the heat of fires that burned for days. But the principles remained sound. Read the wind, calculate the compensation, trust the mathematics, and make the shot. Carlos Hathcock, the legendary Marine sniper who would later achieve fame in Vietnam, trained at an advanced version of the Thornton Chen Academy in the 1950s. His record-breaking shots, X-Pen A, including a kill at over 2,000 yards that stood as a record for decades, were built on foundations that William Thornton had laid 70 years earlier while grieving his brother's death. Hathcock understood something that most people miss, explains Dr. Robert Morrison, a ballistics expert who studied under Marcus Chen in the 1960s. Wind isn't random, it's chaotic, which means it looks random but actually follows predictable patterns if you know how to read them. Thornton figured that out by watching birds. Hathcock applied it with modern equipment. The principle was the same. The computer age brought new tools but confirmed old truths. Modern ballistic computers, with their ability to process thousands of variables simultaneously, contain algorithms directly descended from Hans Zimmermann's mechanical calculations, which were themselves based on William Thornton's hand-drawn wind charts. The billion-dollar precision shooting industry, ITBC, from Olympic competition to military applications, traces its lineage directly back to a converted barn outside San Antonio, where a grieving cowboy and a German clockmaker decided to declare war on the wind. But perhaps the most remarkable testament to Thornton's legacy is this. In an age of electronic wind sensors and computer-controlled rifle systems, serious shooters still make pilgrimages to William Thornton's grave outside San Antonio to test themselves against the same winds that killed his brother James. They come carrying rifles that would seem like magic to the mad cowboy, equipped with technology he couldn't have imagined, but they're still trying to solve the same fundamental problem he'd dedicated his life to understanding. Sarah Thornton's diary, donated to the Smithsonian Institution in 1973, reveals the human cost of innovation that history books rarely mention. 3 children raised largely by a single mother, while their father chased wind patterns across the prairie. A family fortune spent on ammunition and failed prototypes. The constant fear that the next test might be the one that finally killed the man she'd married for better or worse. William never stopped believing that understanding wind was the key to preventing tragedies like James's death, she wrote. I sometimes wondered if his real enemy wasn't the wind at all, but the guilt that drove him to spend 20 years trying to defeat something that had taken his brother in a single moment. The monument at Thornton's grave bears an inscription that's become famous among shooting enthusiasts worldwide. Here lies William Thornton, who made the wind his servant. But the real monument isn't carved in stone. It's written in the lives saved by marksmen, who learned to read wind instead of fighting it, in the democratization of knowledge that was once the privilege of a gifted few, and in the simple truth that obsession, properly directed, can change the world. Modern ballistic computers, for all their sophisticated programming, sometimes produce calculations that experienced shooters ignore in favor of intuitive adjustments that would have made perfect sense to William Thornton. The mad cowboy's deepest insight, tense, that defeating wind required not just calculation but understanding its wild heart, remains as true today as it was in 1876, when a Texas wind pushed a bullet 3 feet wide and changed the course of American firearms development forever. Tech-savvy shooters using the most advanced equipment available still find themselves reaching for Thornton's original principles when their digital tools fail them. In conditions where satellites can't penetrate cloud cover and electronic sensors give conflicting readings, the ability to read wind in the movement of grass, the flight of birds, and the feel of air against skin becomes the difference between success and failure. The wind still blows across the Texas prairie where James Thornton died, and his brother began a quest that would span decades and reshape an industry. But now it blows past monuments to human determination, through the grounds of academies where Thornton's principles are still taught, and over the graves of men who proved that with enough obsession, enough precision, and enough willingness to learn from failure, even the wildest forces of nature can be made to serve human purposes. William Mad Cowboy Thornton never lived to see his complete vindication. He died believing he'd failed, holding a rifle in hands that shook with more than just the effects of his final wound. But his legacy is written in windage calculations used by every precision shooter on Earth, encoded in the algorithms that guide modern ballistic computers, and preserved in the simple truth that one man's grief, properly channeled, had indeed made the wind blow true. The quest that began with a brother's promise in the dust of a Texas ranch had become something larger than William Thornton ever imagined. Proof that human ingenuity, when driven by love and loss and an absolutely unshakable determination to prevent others from suffering the same tragedy, can indeed defeat forces that seem invincible. And somewhere in the Texas wind that never stops blowing, you can still hear the echo of that promise. I'm going to beat it. I'm going to beat the wind. He did.